must have been the wrong time. I'd have said the right thing, but I must have used the wrong line. I've been on the right trail, but I must have used the wrong car. Hit us in a bad place, and I wonder what's good for.
Dr. John, right place at the wrong time, right here on First Degree Liberty. Welcome to another great episode. I'm Mike, and on today's show, Chase and I sit down with Stephan Kinsella, one of the greatest thinkers of our time, to talk a little bit about ethics and understanding where the non-aggression principle comes from. This is going to be a really important show because it's going back to the very fundamentals of what it means to be a libertarian. So check it out. It's going to be a great show, but it's also going to be a very deep show. So you may want to put your thinking caps on here, and I wouldn't operate any heavy machinery if I were you. So keep it locked in right here. Don't forget to share the show with your family and friends. And if you have any comments, email us at firstdegreeliberty@gmail.com. And now, put your thinking caps on and prepare yourself for episode 18 of First Degree Liberty. Special guest, Stephan Kinsella. Broadcasting from New York City and Asheville, North Carolina, it's First Degree Liberty with Chase Rachels and Mike Martelli.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of First Degree Liberty with me, Chase Rachels, and Mike Martelli. Now, today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Stephan Kinsella on the show. How are you doing, Steph?
I'm doing great. How you guys doing?
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Now, Stephan Kinsella is the author of Against Intellectual Property. He's also an adjunct scholar with the Mises Institute and has been the editor of the Property, Freedom, and Society book, Essays in Honor of Hans Hermann Hoppe. So, Stephan, today I kind of wanted to talk about proving and justifying the core libertarian principles of non-aggression and self-ownership, or more accurately, body ownership. So, I think before we do that, though, we should cover the concept of what does a priori mean. So, can you explain for the audience the concept of a priori?
Yeah, a priori is a kind of a Kantian term which has to do with the way you establish a truth, as opposed to a posteriori, which means after the fact, or which usually means empirical. So the scientific method of the natural sciences would be an a posteriori science. Like we don't really know what the causal laws are in the world, and you can't really deduce them. They could be something different than what we might guess they would be. And same thing with historical facts. I mean, these are contingent things that could have been different than they were. But a priori gets at things that you don't have to test to prove that they're correct. In fact, the idea of testing them makes no sense because because you can demonstrate that a given proposition is true by pointing out that to deny it would be self-contradictory, or that it's inherently presupposed somehow in the inquiring process itself. It's sort of an operative presupposition and an unavoidable presupposition of the attempt to disprove it, or of the nature of inquiry itself, something like that.
So that seems pretty similar to me to the content of what an axiom is, correct?
I think it is very similar, at least the way Ayn Rand used it. In mathematics and regular philosophy, axiom just means like an assumption or an assumed fact. Where Rand uses it to refer to these basic ideas that are so basic you couldn't even challenge their validity, like the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction, for example. So I think actually, yes, I think it is similar to that, although Rand would have probably pitched a fit to be compared to Kantian type reasoning. But I think there's a strong similarity between Rand's method of justifying some of her basic concepts, like even free will. She would argue that, and I don't know if I agree with this proof, but the idea that you could never deny free will, because if you're inquiring into whether free will is true or not, you're assuming that we can consider the evidence and decide to accept it or not. So the idea of deciding or choice is sort of built into the inquiry itself. So that's another type of, and I think like Stephan Molyneux calls something like self-detonating arguments, something like that. Right.
Self-detonating arguments or performative contradictions toward the action of arguing actually conflicts with the content of the argument itself.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think a good example of what an a priori truth would be was that there are no square circles, right? If they were square, they wouldn't be circles.
Yeah, you don't have to. And then in economics, I mean, Mises was a sort of neo-Kantian. He uses a lot of a priori reasoning himself in his economics. So basically, he talks about the action axiom, or the action, the law of action. Human action. There are certain aspects of it that we don't like. You don't have to test that the goal of action is to make a profit. That's what action is for, right? We don't have to test whether increasing the minimum wage would cause unemployment. We know that it would. Or we don't have to test that increasing the supply of money tends to cause prices to rise. You can prove these things with just pure reasoning, and they could never possibly be falsified.
Right. Like, for instance, if a human's going to act, it's necessarily true that so long as there's no coercion involved, that if they're acting, they're trying to attempt to transform the universe around them in such a way that's more preferential to them than otherwise would be had they not acted, or else they wouldn't have acted in the first place. Is that sound about right?
Yeah, that's right. And until Kant came along, my understanding is most philosophers would say that yes, there's a priori statements, but they're all circular. They're tautological. They don't prove anything. Like all men are all bachelors are unmarried. It's true by definition, but it doesn't tell you anything about the content of the world. But Kant believed, so they're just analytic, he would call them. So Kant believed that there are synthetic a priori statements. That is, statements that tell you something about truth of the world that are synthetic. That is, they have content, but that are a priori. And Mises believes this too, and so does like a Rothbard, but in an Aristotelian sense. And Hans Hermann Hoppe, as well, is the leading Misesian sort of praxeologist thinker.
Right. So an example of this synthetic a priori truth would be like the law of marginal utility, correct? Or the a priori of action or of discourse, which we are going to get into in a few seconds here.
Right. Exactly. Okay,
cool. And also, before we get in, just one more foundational concept I want to cover is the distinction between ethics and morality. I would view ethics as things or actions which are, if they're broken, if they're violated, which we can use force or the threat thereof to stop. Like if I'm stealing from you, it's justified to use force against me. However, morality could also, in my opinion, encompass things like me lying to my girlfriend or something. That you can't really use force justifiably to stop that, but I think
it's okay to define it like that. I think most people use ethics and morality sort of interchangeably.
Okay.
Including libertarians. I think technically speaking, ethics is more like a narrow set of rules that apply to a certain discipline, like medical ethics or something like that. And they're related to morality, but it's not really a general thing about right and wrong. It's more about the right rules of conduct, particular to a suitable suitable to a particular endeavor or field or something like that.
Okay, so maybe we can do legal rights as opposed to morality. Then would that be more accurate in your? Well,
I think like Hoppe uses the word ethics, and he's talking about political ethics, and so I think it's because he's talking about what rules, and so libertarians care about what rules, or we say justified, and most libertarians would say something like, not all things that are immoral should be illegal. Right. But most of them would say that they think rights are the things that correspond to that which should be illegal.
Right.
So rights and laws go together. But I think most libertarians I've heard this said many times that rights are a subset of morals. But I'm not actually sure if I agree with that. I think they're intersecting sets, because I'm not so sure that even if you establish that there's a right, that I don't know if that proves that violating the right is immoral. It just proves that it's unjustified.
Right. That makes sense. So I think perhaps for the sake of the discussion here, we can just distinguish between what are rights and what are things which are categorized as moral or immoral. So rights being possibly, but not necessarily a subset of morality, but which implies something different necessarily than a violation of morality would. Like, it's, for instance, like you said, if I'm violating a right, I could also be violating social mores, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all social mores can be enforced by the use of physical force or threats.
Yeah, and I think that to show that something is a right means that that I mean, I've thought about this a long time because most definitions are either circular or they're just sort of incomplete. Probably the best one I'd read up until I started thinking about it was probably James Sadowski, who I think he's a Jesuit priest, and I think Rothbard quotes him, and he says something like, I can't remember the definition now, but something about we only mean when we say there's a right that it would be immoral or something like that to use force to stop someone from having that right or something like that. But the way I think about it is a right is the type of freedom within a given sphere that implies that if force is used by the holder of the right to prevent other people from infringing on that right, then that use of force cannot be coherently criticized by someone else as being unjustified in some sense. I think that's kind of what it means to have a right, that you can't really. You could criticize them on moral grounds. You could say, you're being horrible and standing on your rights and not letting that poor woman take a loaf of bread from your store when she's starving. But you can't say that he has no right, basically, to enforce that right.
So basically, rights are those things which, if violated, physical force or the threat thereof will be justified in attaining retribution or defending those rights. Correct?
Yes, although I do think that it's possible to imagine a society where physical force is rarely used to, like there's other ways that rights are enforced without physical force than just by ostracism or social pressure.
Yes.
But it would still be regarded as a law.
Right. I completely
having
agree.
Consequences, yeah.
I completely agree. I think Robert Murphy has some good work on that as well, and so has Hans Hermann Hoppe on private law societies. So let's get into it then for argumentation ethics, and this is where I feel like some breaking ground has been made as a compared to natural rights theorists or even just utilitarians, is that through discourse ethics, I think we've finally started bridging the gap between the is-ought problem. And would you mind for the audience, Stefan, to kind of give a summary of argumentation ethics and what they actually, how they prove self-ownership in NAP?
Well, yeah. So let's talk briefly about how different people come to their libertarian beliefs or think that they're justified. I think a lot of people are sort of pragmatic or practical, or you might call them utilitarian or even consequentialist. They think that it's a practical way of achieving general overall societal happiness or something like that. That's more of a practical sort of pragmatic approach, and a lot of people are like that. And I think that's fine. Consequentialism, I think, is fine. But the problem is it tends to lead to unprincipled thinking, and people are afraid to be too radical because this is not really that rigorous of an argument. So it just kind of pushes you in certain directions. So utilitarians tend to be not anarchists, in my experience. Then you have the kind of natural rights type tradition, which is this kind of Aristotelian idea that by man's nature, certain things are natural to the way we should operate in the world, and then they use that kind of argument combined with economic literacy and things like that to come up with libertarian conclusions. Now, the one problem with that argument, I think it's fine as far as it goes, but it's more of a consequentialist type of argument. If you accept that man has a nature, and if you accept that we want to achieve certain values, then by our nature, we should live in peace and harmony with each other, etc. So it's really not what Kant would call a categorical argument. It doesn't start from the ground up. It assumes certain things. And that's because, as Hume argued, there is an is-ought problem. And some natural law types don't agree with that. They think that that's not really a true problem. I think it is. I think it's the idea that you can't go from an is to an ought. That is, you can't go from a description of the way the world is or the way man's nature is and conclude that therefore you should do this, because you're introducing a normative statement or a should all of a sudden into the conversation without any foundation to build it on. It's like going from one category to the other, from descriptive to prescriptive, we would call it. Right. So when you all of a sudden see that snuck into an argument, you always have to just insert it somewhere, and there's no justification given for the should. One of my friends says that it's a hypothetical imperative, but it's not a regular. It's an assertoric, which he says it's not if then, it's since then. So what he says is, and this is my friend Jeffrey Plauché, he says that you can show that since man has this nature and since man does want to do certain things, therefore these things follow. But I think that's sort of kind of trying to do what argumentation ethics does. Now, argumentation ethics, I first learned about it in 1988. There was a symposium in Liberty magazine. It was an article by Hans Hermann Hoppe, sort of introducing this idea to the libertarian world. And what he did was he built upon a previous theory called discourse ethics by his professor, Jürgen Habermas, who's a famous philosopher in Germany, and another German philosopher named Karl Otto Appel. They're kind of socialists, but they have this idea that the nature of human discourse has certain normative presuppositions built into it. And therefore, you could never establish as true in an argument or a discourse something that was a proposition that contradicted those norms, because you're always going to be in performative contradiction. So then the question is, well, what are those norms? Now, they use their own argument to kind of come up with social democratic ideas, rights of welfare and education and all this. I think it's a flimsy application of their own basic idea. Now, Hoppe learned this, and he became a Misesian and a Rothbardian, and then it occurred to him he could use their basic idea, applying Austrian economic insights about the nature of property and scarcity, and Rothbardian insights about political insights, mm-hmm. to show that this is the basic way you can justify libertarian norms. And his basic argument was that any norm, and by norm I mean a rule that is going to be applied, like a law in society, has to be justified for it to make sense and for it to be a valid norm. It has to be justified. But to be justified, it has to be justified in argumentation between two people, because that's what justification is. Argument necessarily is communicative, language using, argumentative justification. Mm-hmm. All justification has to be argumentative. And he would say, if anyone denies this, they're going to deny it in an argument. They're kind of undercutting themselves. You can only even object to that by engaging in some kind of discourse or discussion with someone. So then he says, so any norm that it can ever be possibly justified has to be justified in the context of an argumentation, which means that whatever the norms are of argumentation, if there are any, that is, the norms that are inherently and necessarily presupposed by the participants, then you could never come up with an argument against that. And to take a kind of a narrow example, let's suppose you have 3 guys go to a Star Trek convention, and they all love Star Trek. It would be like people at the convention who are all fans challenging each other to prove that Star Trek should be liked. And all you'd have to do is look at the other guy and say, well, you're here too. You agree that Star Trek should be liked. Mm-hmm. I agree that it should be liked. Why don't you prove to me why you think it should be liked? Why would you demand of me a proof of something that you yourself necessarily believe just by being here? Right. And so Hans Hoppe's argument is a broader one than that, and it's about the normative presuppositions of argumentation as such. And what he tries to show is what these presuppositions are, and then to show that only the libertarian ethic, he calls it, set of rules, could be compatible with it. And every other ethic is basically a socialistic type of ethic, is going to be in contradiction with the normative presuppositions of the people trying to justify the socialist ethic.
Right. So basically, I think what those presuppositions are is that if you are engaging in an argument is inherently conflict-free, not so much that you're going to be in agreement on the points, but insofar as there's going to be a lack of physical coercion, because the whole purpose of an argument is to determine a certain truth. It's a set of truth claims, correct?
Yep.
So basically, by engaging in an argument, you're already accepting the fact that you're not going to use coercion or physical violence to get the other person to concede, because that defeats the purpose of the argument to persuade.
That's right. That's not what argumentation is. If there's a threat of coercion, like if you don't accept what I'm saying, I'm going to bash you over the head, then it's like a coerced testimony for a trial. I mean, that's not really real evidence of what the guy actually did. He's just saying it to avoid being hurt. So that's not a genuine argumentation.
Right. And furthermore, that it also has to be presupposed that the person you're arguing with owns themselves. Otherwise, it's a completely moot action. Why would you want to talk with someone who is not responsible or accountable for their own actions or words or mindset, right?
So Hoppe would say that there's an implicit and inherently unavoidable agreement between the parties to agree to disagree if they have to. In other words, if they can't reach agreement based upon the force of their arguments, then they're not going to coerce each other. So there's an agreement to disagree if they have to, which is an implicit respecting of the other person's body rights. And I'm not going to attack your body. Mm-hmm. And also, the participants in argument necessarily value the ability to engage in argument and the activity of arguing. And by arguing, I don't mean contentious. You could call it discourse or discussing, civilized, reasoned discourse. So they inherently value the ability to engage in this kind of activity, which has certain what Hoppe calls practical preconditions. It has logical ones as well. Like, for example, the idea of universalizability, which means that if you're formulating a norm, and other ones like consistency and honesty, because if you're trying to find the truth of whatever is being discussed, then inconsistency and contradictory statements would undermine that goal, right? So there's a whole host of sort of logical related rules that the participants can't deny without falling into contradiction. But there are practical ones as well, and that is that the other person, yes, has to be free of your coercion, which is the same thing as saying they have the right to control their body, which is the same thing as saying they have body ownership.
Yes.
So already just the idea of having a peaceful discussion with someone presupposes that both sides recognize the other person has the right to control their own body. But then Hoppe says it's more than just that, because argumentation in the practical real world is not just a free-floating activity. It has to take place in a given world of scarcity where the participants were able to survive and to able to use resources to get there and to have a platform to actually, have sitting room to sit down and face each other and have a conversation, which implies some ability to use resources in the world, like the land you're standing on or the food that nourished you and helped you get there. Just the ability to have successful action, of which argumentation is a type, requires the ability to use scarce resources. That's what human action is.
Right.
And so therefore, the people participating in discourse can't deny the sort of value or the goodness or the justifiability of people using resources. But to use resources, these resources were at one point unused or in the state of, the state of nature. So that means for them to ever be used, someone has to first use them. That is, to pluck them out of the state of nature and start to use them. And you have to have the right to do it. Otherwise, you could hit someone over the head and take their stuff and prevent them from being able to argue. So that's how he extends the argument to the idea of property.
Right. And I think he also discuss how the original appropriation and voluntary exchange, those are the only just ways to really acquire property, and necessarily so. It's not just a convention, because the convention implies that there's plausible alternatives, but there are no real alternatives to this norm, which, being a norm, is meant to try to mitigate as much conflict as possible.
Yes.
So any other way of acquiring property would only generate conflict. For instance, if we always said the second person gets it, or a different group of people who are never there gets it, this would only generate conflict between the person who discovered it and the other group of people, or the first and the second person. So only the first person who uses it can necessarily be the only one that's conflict free in acquiring it, because there's no competing claims necessarily to the first one there, right?
Yep, exactly. And not only that, any norm that you propose and the reasons given to justify it have to be based upon some objective things about the world that everyone could, at least in principle, agree upon in a discussion. It can't just be something arbitrary. If it's totally arbitrary, then you could have everyone could make up their own arbitrary reasons, which is the same thing as not having an argumentation or a discourse at all. It's basically just asserting what you're going to do and being willing to use force for it, which is, again, against the idea of being conflict free and arguing. So you couldn't to say it's the second guy instead of the first guy. Not only does it generate conflict, it also is totally arbitrary. I mean, yes. Why not the third? Or why not the fourth? I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever. So that's another reason for the first person having to. And by the way, Anthony de Jasse and also Hoppe do talk about this, and also Rothbard. What they do is they go through the only other possible rules that there could be. It's basically universal communism. Everyone owns a little 1/6 billionth piece of all the other people in the world,
Mm-hmm.
or some kind of slavery or self-ownership. That's basically all there is, or homesteading of things by one person. And universal communism makes no sense whatsoever. If I own a piece of you and you own a piece of me, then who owns what? Plus, it's totally unworkable, because if everyone in the world owned you and everything out there, you'd have to get everyone's permission before you could take any action whatsoever, and we would all die of starvation, and the human race would just starve out.
And you can't even give permission, because you can't do anything without getting permission. So it's that infinite regression issue, right?
Yeah. You couldn't even ask permission, because that requires resources too. And so then the other alternative is basically slavery. So that means one person dominates and owns the other, but that is not a universalizable rule. That's just an arbitrary assertion that I'm different than you, and I get to own you and you don't get to own me. That is not a universalizable rule that could be accepted as fair potentially be accepted as fair by everyone. It's actually the opposite of arguing, because it's just asserting I'm different than you and I'm just going to do it.
Right. So would you say it's fair to say that for something to be considered a valid right, that would have to be both universalizable and practically actionable? Does that make sense? Like,
what do you mean practically actionable?
Meaning, like, for instance, even though the communist scenario is universalized, no one can actually act, because, like you said, you can't permission or whatever.
Yeah, because it would be incompatible with what you're doing. You're both engaged in an argumentation, which you're doing without the permission of everyone on the earth.
Exactly, and that's the performative contradiction. That's why I love it so much, Stefan, because it really does bridge that is odd gap. It really does show an incontrovertible proof for these NAP and self-ownership. Now I want to ask another question. It's kind of getting more advanced here, which is that I think it's a folly to limit the NAP to human beings. I think what the reason why we have rights, and I think Hoppe refers to this, is because we are rational beings. That is, we are capable of making rational propositions. Yep. Can you explain that concept a little bit? Because even Hoppe, to me, seems kind of vague on that a little bit, and I kind of want to really root that concept out of why is being able to make rational propositions the thing that grants you these rights?
Well, I think it follows from his belief in the argumentation ethics approach, is that all rights or all norms, including laws and rights related ones, have to arise out of argumentation, which is a process of communication among obviously beings that can communicate with each other, which requires a certain level of intelligence and use of language and concepts. But that would apply to anything that could do that. It wouldn't apply just to humans. There's nothing in there about humans. It's whatever types of beings can communicate with each other. I think the idea is that there's a certain reciprocity. It's a little bit like contractarianism to a degree. There's a little bit of reciprocity in the idea. The idea is that these two, let's say, imagine two participants to an argumentation. They both have to recognize also this argumentation ethics justification for libertarianism as well. And if they do, then they're basically both agreeing to respect each other's rights. Mm-hmm. So sort of, I'm going to agree to respect your rights, and it's sort of in exchange, you're respecting mine. So there's reciprocity there. But a dumb creature cannot even agree to respect your rights. Now, it might be something harmless like a puppy, but the puppy is still not consciously recognizing that you have rights and agreeing to respect them. Mm-hmm. So he's not agreeing to respect your rights. So there's no possibility of this reciprocity there that would allow, the animals to have rights, or non-intelligent, non-sapient, or non-sentient animals.
And it's not even that he's refusing to. It's not like he's refusing to respect your rights. It's that they don't have the capacity to respect your rights. Correct? That's the major distinction.
They don't have. Yeah, no, they might not physically be a threat to you, but they just cannot agree to respect your rights. And he has some comments about, children and things like this, and which is, sort of shows that at a certain age, the child reaches enough capacity to have full human adult rights. Mm-hmm. So I think his paradigm applies to the gray areas pretty nicely, and also to the animal case. And if computers ever wake up, or dolphins ever evolve, or extraterrestrial beings come to the planet someday, and they're intelligent enough to discuss with us, then as long as they respect our rights, then they would have rights as well.
Right. So, Mike, do you have any thoughts on this? You've been kind of just observing, or any commentary?
Yeah, I'm just observing because it's Monday, so I'm not really sure I'm at the intellectual capacity to deal to talk intelligently on this subject. So I don't want to dumb down the conversation.
Okay, well, that's fine. Well, that brings up another important question, Stefan, which is I think that I've read Murray Rothbard's Ethics of Liberty, and he talks about the reason why children are granted rights, even as babies, when of course they don't have the capacity to engage in communication,
Right.
like we do, is because they're future potential adults. Would you be willing to kind of root that concept a little bit and kind of explain that a little better?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more of the maybe an Aristotelian way of looking at it. I mean,
So
look,
how would you look at it?
the issue of children's rights and all this kind of stuff is a hard one. I think there's two ways you could look at it. One, you could say that basically, even babies don't really have complete human rights yet because they don't have the capacity to respect your rights yet. They're not conscious enough, or they're not intelligent enough yet to do that. And then you would say, well, then the parent owns it basically until it wakes up and has rights, and so then the parent would protect it, its child as its property from aggressors in that sense. Lauren Lemansky, in his book Persons, Rights, and the Moral Community, has this argument where he calls it piggybacking. He says that what he calls sort of defective humans, people that are maybe in comas or kind of retarded, or I guess very young children. We sort of we extend our full human rights to them by this sort of piggybacking idea. I don't know if that quite works. My view is that either because they have the potential, like Rothbard said, that it's hard to draw the line about where exactly rights arise. So we have to err on the side of caution and treat them as if they have rights, even when they're just infants. And in my view, even when they're fetuses. My kind of take on the abortion issue, I don't think the law should prohibit abortion, even though I do think it's
Right.
kind of tantamount to murder in the late stages. I just think it's too problematic to treat it like murder, but or to outlaw it, put it that way. But I tend to think abortion is almost always immoral, even in the early stages, and it gets increasingly immoral as it develops. And then at a certain point, we would attribute rights to the fetus, like in the later stages. And
Right.
It's a rights violation too at that point.
I would agree insofar that abortion is immoral, how we defined it earlier. And like you
Yes.
said, it gets more and more, progressively more immoral as the fetus develops. However, I tend to side with Rothbard in the fact that I don't believe it to be a rights violation due to his whole eviction theory. That is that kind of like, it's like the positive rights and negative rights.
Right.
The fetus doesn't have a positive right to sustenance from the mother. And the mother has sovereign domain over her own body. How
Right.
do you think? What do you think about that?
I've never agreed with that argument because I just think it seems perverse to refer to the fetus as a trespasser when it was invited by the actions of the mother.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see how it's a trespasser in most cases. I mean, it was invited. It was caused to exist by voluntary actions of the parents.
I think it's akin to the argument like if you invited Joe Bob over and then Joe Bob decided to be he started acting uncivilized, you want him to get out, but he refuses to leave. At the point where he refuses to leave, and even though you invited him initially, then he'd be a trespasser.
Yes, I agree with that. But the baby never does any misconduct. And number two, suppose this Joe Bob is on your airplane. You can't just kick him out when you get tired of him. You have to wait till you land, or if there's a dinner party at your house and there's a huge hurricane starts in the middle of dinner.
Mm-hmm.
You can't kick your guests out into this this death storm. You have to. You can only kick them out if it's kind of safe.
I don't know. I think you could give him a parachute and a good luck buddy, and then kick him out the door. In both cases, hurricane or the plane situation.
I mean, Walter Block argues that you can't try to kill the fetus, but if it gets killed in the process of evicting it, well, tough luck. I think that's wrong. I think you can't evict it if it would mean killing it. I do think if the mother's life is in danger or something like that, then that's okay. But just optional abortion. I think there is see, I'm not against positive obligations. I think that libertarians are wrong to say there are no positive obligations. I just say there's no unchosen positive obligations.
Right. And that's how I mean it. There's no inherent positive obligation. You're not positive. You're not owed anything by virtue of your being. You only have the right to not be aggressed against others by virtue of your own being. And of course, through voluntary interactions, you can create positive obligations. For instance, if I pay you to do something and you don't do it, I mean, that's a positive obligation you've incurred, correct? To do
well, that. Not if you go by Rothbard's title theory.
Right. I'm paying you like money. Contract. That's the title transfer, right? Like I'm giving you money in exchange for a service from you.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean there's an obligation to perform the service. It just means that if you don't perform the service, you don't get the money.
No, I'm saying you pay up front. Like you pay up.
Well, still, I think then the contract would have to specify what happens if you don't perform. Maybe there's a reverse damages payment, so that means you have to transfer some money back to the other guy.
Interesting.
Now you could argue that there's a moral obligation if you make a promise.
Right.
But by Rothbard's theory, contracts is probably not the best way to illustrate the positive. A better one would be if you commit a crime. There's a positive obligation to, not just to stop, but to apologize and try to make restitution and to turn yourself in maybe or whatever. I mean, there's lots of positive. Or the example I give is like let's say you push someone maliciously into a lake who can't swim. I think you have a positive obligation to jump in and rescue them. Okay, because you have created the situation where you put them in a position of peril and danger, and the damage you've done to them is going to even be worse if you don't rescue them. So you're responsible for that. So you're responsible to stop it. And I analogize that to the case of having a child. When you create a child, you're creating a being that by human nature is going to be inherently helpless for some period of time after birth.
Right.
So if you don't take care of that baby, then you're violating its rights, because it's like you put it in a position of peril, like pushing someone in a lake. You created it in a natural position of peril, in the sense, a natural position of dependency and need. And so I think the one who created that being has the obligation to help it. Now, whether the law should enforce that or not, I don't think so. But I don't think that you just have the negative duty to not prevent someone from coming onto your property to rescue the child, like Walter Block would argue. I think you have the positive duty to care for the child, feed it, shelter it, etc. So I think there is a positive obligation there.
Okay, that's a very interesting argument. And going back to the title transfer contract theory, basically how I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, so I very well may be, but it's that if you transfer title over a physical good in your possession, like for instance, if I'm trading you a car for $10,000 and I give you my car, but you don't give me $10,000, you have implicitly stolen my $10,000, and therefore,
yeah, that's what Rothbard does say that. He talks about implicit theft.
Right.
I think that's a mistake in his contract theory. I think his contract theory is brilliant and revolutionary, but I think that's a mistake, and I don't think it should be part of it because it's wrong. Mm-hmm. I've never heard of implicit theft in my life before Rothbard said that. I don't know what implicit theft is.
I definitely agree that promises alone are not binding. Even if it's like a concert organizer saying, "Hey, let's sign a contract saying that you're going to perform here, and I'll pay you X amount of money," and the guy never shows up to perform. I don't think he has violated anyone's rights there, because that's still just a promise. Where it gets kind of gray for me is if the guy actually pays him a physical thing up front, because now he has transferred title over good to him, and the other guy hasn't reciprocated. That's where it gets kind of gray to me.
Yeah, but see, the way I look at that is, well, first of all, let's suppose I'm right that it's not implicit theft. Okay.
Sure.
Well, in such a legal system, why would you pay someone ahead of time? I mean, maybe you'd put it in with a third party escrow agency or something, or something like that, or maybe you make the guy give you a performance bond.
Right, that made more sense. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, so Walter gives this example too about, and we had a whole podcast recently about voluntary slavery. I mean, Rothbard says that, let's say you have let's say you borrow $1,000 from Joe, and you're supposed to repay $1,100 in a year. 10% interest, let's say, and you don't repay and when the due date comes due, you don't repay Joe. Then Rothbard says theoretically that's implicit theft, and theoretically you can go to debtor's prison for that, but that's probably disproportionate.
Yeah, I heard that podcast actually. You had a block, and I thought it was very interesting. And where I disagree with the block was that you stole that $1,100. But where I think I might disagree with you is I do think that they did steal the $1,000 that was actually given. The
problem with that is, and Hoppe points this out, and I think Rothbard does too. Any theory of rights has to always answer the question at a given moment in time about who owns this. Just for the same reason that communism couldn't work, right? Because you would never be able to get permission from everyone to use this resource.
Right.
If you have to wait to a later time to determine who has the ownership of this thing, then it's not usable.
Oh.
So you have to be able to determine on the day the loan is made who owns that $1,000. And in fact, it's not conditional at all, because the guy that's borrowing the money needs to be able to spend it. That's why he's borrowing the money, to spend it on some business or whatever. He can't spend the money unless he owns it outright. And that is without conditions. So the $1,000 is given to him completely, unconditionally, without any strings. It's given to him in exchange for his future title transfer of a future $1,100, which is different than the $1,000.
I see. So basically what you're saying is something cannot be stolen unless it's actually owned.
You can't retroactively determine something was theft when it wasn't theft.
Right, because he doesn't own the future thing, because he doesn't own it until he actually owns it. He doesn't own it until he actually has it in his hands and he's actually owning it and it exists. It doesn't. The future thing doesn't actually exist yet. It's because
so you can't steal the $1,100. If you're penniless, if you actually have money and you refuse to repay it, that is theft, because I would say the money you holding converts to the ownership of the lender. And now if you don't turn it over to him, you're basically trespassing.
Okay. So if you have capacity to pay it back, then you are stealing.
Yes. But if you're penniless, then there's nothing that exists to steal. And in fact, the parties had to know that possibility when they contracted, because the future is inherently uncertain. So they have to know that I'm giving you an existing $1,000 in exchange for an uncertain future thing.
Right. It's a gamble, right?
It's a gamble. Yeah. The future's always a gamble in a sense, right?
That
I don't think you can wait. You can't like a year later say, well, that $1,000 that I borrowed, turns out I was really stealing it. I mean, well, then how did I spend it? How was I able to?
Right.
With the consent, so anyway.
And I think these conversations are really cool, not because the hypothetical is always going to happen, because they're usually kind of out there hypotheticals, but I think they really kind of root out the theories behind them. Because like I said, I don't think this would be an issue in a totally free anarcho-capitalist or free market anarchist society, because maybe people will always deal with contract insurance. So if let's say that one of the parties reneges, the party who was reneged on can go to that guy's contract insurance, make a claim, and then the contract insurance has to deal with his client directly. And if he doesn't pay them, he's black flagged, or his so-called credit score would be hurt, and this would incentivize him to not renege, and so on and so on.
Well, and not only that, I'm going to have contract insurance that says we're going to insure your contracts, but only if you engage in certain reasonable practices of checking the credit out of people you do contracts with, including people on our blacklist. And so, in other words, you can't do a contract with someone on our blacklist because they're a known risk. And so that means people are not going to engage in contracts with people with bad reputations in the first place anyway. Yes. So it's a self-reinforcing kind of process there.
Yeah.
Now, I do think reputation would play a huge role. Of course, people are going to try to pay their debts off, because otherwise, like we just said, they're going to suffer repercussions.
Right. And I think this is a much more rational system, because in it's in everyone's self-interest to not renege, to follow through on commitments, and to provide a service that other people like, because these are the only ways in which they can actually, or at least with the least amount of obstacles, accrue the most amount of wealth and influence and power, if you will.
Yeah, of course. And you don't become successful in the first place without having the type of character that leads you to have been accepted into society already with other people. And of course, we're talking the simple contract. It's not like if you're penniless on the due date of the loan that you get off scot-free. I mean, most loans would have the subsidiary title transfer provision saying that, if you can't pay me back on the due date, then interest keeps accruing, and
Sure.
as soon as you come into money in the future, you have to, or I can garnish your wages or a certain percentage of your wages, or until you pay it off, something like that.
That makes a lot of sense. And the last thing I want to cover tonight, if you will, is this whole idea that you can own certain external goods like an apple or corn, but you can't own land. I think what's the Georgists who say you can't actually own land or something like that.
I think they say you can own it, but you have to pay this single tax.
Right. So how would you approach someone who says that you can't own land? Like how would you show them that you really can? How you can go from owning your body, how can you make the jump from that to being able to own actual land or space, if you will?
I just don't think there's an argument that land is another type of scarce resource. It's not really that different than any other type of scarce resource. It's in fact, it can be, we can make more land in some ways. You can build islands, you could build platforms. Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to make land.
Yeah, that's true.
And even if you can't make it, it's still a scarce resource. Now, I do think that sometimes when you appropriate land, it could be subject to. In other words, appropriation doesn't have to be all or nothing. So you could have someone, and Hoppe talks about this in his Libertarian Papers article from a couple years ago. Let's say you have a community with a kind of a common road, which no one has really tried to explicitly appropriate, but everyone uses it to travel, down to the river or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What they have acquired over time is this community, this group of people have acquired kind of an easement. So it's like a partial ownership right in the land, or the right to use the land in a certain way. And so then if someone else then homesteads the road, they have to homestead it subject to the easement that was already homesteaded. So they would homestead the road, but then they wouldn't be able to stop people from, say, walking across it to go down to the river, because they already had established that right.
Right, because that was the state of nature, or quote unquote nature it was in at the time they homesteaded it, right?
Yeah, they only homesteaded what was left. They only homesteaded what was remaining unowned, which was, certain use rights of it, minus this kind of easement right to cross it.
Right, and for the audience to kind of elaborate on the easement concept, basically, if I bought some land next to an airport, I couldn't, the day after I bought the land next to an airport, which the jets made a lot of noise, an injunction to get the airport to stop flying planes and make noises, because that was already there before I had purchased that property. Does that kind of explain it? Yeah,
the common law has already said something similar, but with a different doctrine called coming to the nuisance. So normally you would say, if I have a house and I'm using it for certain residential purposes, and someone puts an airport up right next to me, they're disturbing my peaceful use of my property. It's a type of trespass, or it's called a nuisance.
Mm-hmm.
So I could get that enjoined, where the law says, well, if you come to the nuisance, then you can't. And I think a conceptually cleaner way of saying it would be the libertarian approach, which is what you just said, that the airport has already homesteaded this certain easement right of the they own the land the airports own, and they own the surrounding area for purposes of emitting noise, something like that.
Right.
But so when you homestead a tract of land next to the airport, you're only it's like the path idea. You're only homesteading what's not already owned by someone else. So you take it subject to that easement.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the only thing that was kind of weird to me when we talked about the common road thing is I've always looked at homesteading as requiring two parts, which is, of course, the primary one, which is actually mixing your labor or transforming or doing something with that previously unclaimed piece of property that was never done before. And then
bordering it is Hoppe's general term. Setting up borders.
Sure.
Borders.
So that's the first thing. But I thought something after that would be like you have to actually explicitly claim it. Like if I'm walking down a path that was never unknown, I'm making marks in the trees, and I just walk away. Well, is it really mine? Because I never really claimed it. I thought it was like a combination of claiming it and mixing your labor with it. I didn't realize.
I think it is. In other words, but sometimes the claiming is inherent in your use of it. Like,
okay.
If you build a farm and you put a fence up around it, it's clear that you're using it, and you're using it as an owner. You're intending to own it.
So it's like an implicit claim almost.
Yeah, I think it's an obvious claim. It's a transparent claim. I mean, I guess it becomes obvious the second someone else tries to take it from you, and if you resist, then it shows that you're claiming as an owner.
Sure.
Or if you deny them permission, you're acting as an owner.
Sure.
If you're really some kind of communist or ultra pacifist and you just let people walk all over and you never say anything, I guess you're just merely possessing it and you're not even intending to own it as an owner.
Right. Or you're just not exercising your property rights. Right.
Yeah. I guess there's two ways to look at it. So I think some things you would need to make a claim because otherwise it would be not clear. But let's say you have an airline and you regularly fly across the sky in a certain place. You could say that regular use is homesteading that airway for that use. Or if you have a radio broadcast, then you're broadcasting over a certain wave band in a certain geographic region information. You're sort of establishing your use of that part of the EM spectrum in that area.
Right. That makes sense. And basically, I think there's usually this objection of, well, that might be a right and everything, but who cares if it's not enforceable? And I think the practical answer to that is, well, in a free society, you're probably going to have third-party property certifiers who have a list of criteria that needs to be met before they put their stamp of certification on there, which it would be reputable. Otherwise, you wouldn't contract with them probably. And that's kind of how that works out.
And also you're going to want, if it's just like today, if you purchase a house, you have to get a title search done, and then especially if you take a mortgage out, you're required to get title insurance, we call it,
right.
Which means some companies saying that if it turns out that the guy you're buying it from didn't really have good title for some reason, then we'll make it up to you. We'll give you the $700,000 to go buy another house. So they're only going to give you that insurance after they do a thorough title search and they're confident that they're not going to have to pay up.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
People would have property insurance in society, especially for large things. And to get that, they're going to have some regular set of records that people look at and that they trust to engage in that type of insurance business.
Right, and it's in those property certification agencies' best interest to have this reciprocity between themselves so that they can kind of verify there's not a competing or conflicting title on that property that someone else is trying to claim, right?
Yeah, not only that, people are going to patronize insurance companies and defense agencies and justice agencies that have this cooperative attitude, so that you're not hiring the one company that's warlike and expensive and always causing problems. So there's a natural incentive to go to the ones that are have a cooperative attitude.
Absolutely, and that makes so much sense to me. Being cooperative is more peaceful and it's more efficient, and it just makes so much sense to me in this sort of society. It's the difference isn't in function. We're not saying the services the state provides should not be provided. What we're saying is that the incentive structure for the provision under the state system is really defunct when compared with the free market, and of course it's also unethical.
Yeah, you could even see something like the statute of limitations arising privately, although we're against legislation and statutes, but the idea if you wait too long to make a complaint about some wrong done to you, or if you wait too long to claim property you think is yours, after a certain time you're going to say, listen, you had the chance over the last 10 years to sue this guy for contract breach, or to accuse him of rape, or whatever, or to say that this guy's on my great grandpa's land. You kind of, over time, evidence gets harder to, it's more stale, it's less fresh. A lot of witnesses are dead now,
right?
So you're making a fair trial more difficult by your own delays. So it's kind of your fault that you're putting the guy you're suing in a worse position now. He's going to have a harder time defending himself, let's say, because the evidence is more stale. So you could see companies increasingly frowning, or society increasingly frowning upon people who wait too long. And not only that, I mean, like if you sue me for my property, claiming that 500 years ago there's a defect in the chain of title, I mean, at a certain point in time, people are going to say, look, it's too long ago to even know. We can't even prove it with certainty, so it's just too late. So over time, property titles become more certain. And by the way, it's a mistake a lot of libertarians make. They think that, or people that criticize libertarianism too, they assume that our Lockean homesteading idea means you have to prove your title all the way back to the very first homesteader. And since we can't do that in most cases, there's some defect in libertarian theory. You don't really have to do that. All you have to do is prove a better claim than anyone else in the world. And in some cases, that theoretically means that if you can prove it all the way back to the first act of homesteading, then that's the best of all. But you don't have to do that. All you have to do is prove that you have a better claim than anyone else. And if we don't know what happened 1,000 years ago, but we know what happened 500 years ago, and then ever since then there's been a chain of title from whoever was using it 500 years ago to now, then you still have a better claim than anyone else because no one can theoretically prove anything before that.
Yes, I'm so happy you made that point because that's one that's made a lot, and I think that's a great explanation for and a clarification on it. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes sense too with the companies or the arbitration agencies not wanting to try cases which involve things that happened 15, 20, or 50 years ago, because if they're not confident they can come up with a verdict which is pretty amicable for both parties involved, which is going to be, tying into the reputation, then they might not want to try it in the first place because, again, they value the reputation because that's what gets the customers, right? So, that makes a lot of sense.
Plus, I think generally people, you're not going to go hire an insurance company and pay them a fee on the contingency that they're going to protect you from things that happened 50 years ago. I mean, you don't really need them to do that. It's really more perspective than that.
Right.
I think that's part of it too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Stephan, for coming on today. I really enjoyed the show with you, and thank you so much for your time and consideration. Would you like to put in some plugs for some of your websites or projects or anything?
Well, yeah, if you go to stephankinsella.com, I have a new podcast, which I'm going to re-podcast this on as well, Kinsella on Liberty. It's at my site, stephankinsella.com. But on my publications tab there, I have an article called Argumentation Ethics, a Concise Guide, or something like that. And it sort of summarizes this argumentation ethics thing we talked about and has links to Hoppe's stuff and some of my articles on it. I have something similar called Estoppel, which is a similar type of argument. And those of others like Stephen Molyneux and Frank Van Dunn and others. So there's a wealth of resources in that short article directing people to more pieces about that topic if they want to look further.
Great. And just one last thing. Have you heard of Stephan's universally preferable behavior?
Yes.
When I've read it, and then I read Hoppe's argumentation ethics, and it seems like UPB is just kind of a repackaged form of argumentation ethics. Does that seem?
Yeah, it seems to be. I'm not aware that he has read much of Hoppe's stuff. I think he might have come up with it on his own.
Yeah, coincidentally, right?
Yeah. So I think it is similar in broad outline. I think Hoppe's is the most rigorous one I've seen, and Van Dunn's as well. There's a lot of similar arguments by other writers, and the basic logic of it is, you can go back for hundreds of years and find thinkers who have said things that are similar. Like, if even Locke said something like, people that violate others' rights can be treated like wild animals, because there's sort of an inconsistency in claiming the protection of rights while you're violating rights.
And that's the estoppel approach that you're talking about right now.
Yes, and I think that complements and is consistent with Hoppe's approach too. Yeah, that's the estoppel approach as well.
Great. Well, thank you again, Stephan. We really enjoyed it. And Mike will put the link to your Concise Guide to Argumentation Ethics on there. And Mike, would you mind giving Stephan your email address so he can send you the audio file for this podcast?
Sure. My email address is actually, just use the firstdegreeliberty@gmail.com.
Okay.
That makes it easy.
I'll do it.
Yeah, and you can probably just send them on the Skype messenger too.
You can try that too. Yep.
Cool. Well, thank you, Stephan, and I hope you'll join us again sometime in the future because we really enjoyed your presence here. Thank you.
I'd like to. I enjoyed it too. Thanks, guys.
This year, you should check out the most critically acclaimed podcast on the net. First Degree Liberty is the winner of more made-up awards than any other podcast. The New York Times calls it stunning, breathtaking, by far the greatest podcast ever. It's a heartwarming confirmation of the can-do American spirit inside us all. First Degree Liberty, starring Chase Rachels and Mike Martelli.